And Jonathan, you do have, there's a note in the chat from Ethan, I think, who's having some difficulty connecting and wanted to know if there's a call-in option.
There is, yep. There is a number. Let me get it from the chat. While I'm doing that, Paula, go ahead with your question.
Yeah. So I would like you to clarify about the scope of the visioning process, because Elizabeth said, so I'm in the World Language Advisory Committee, and she said in the committee that the scope of the visioning process committee is instructional. So they cannot recommend for a third site or moving, for example, Claremont location to a more centric, that can be a better location for it. So I want to clarify if they have that as a part of the scope. And the same goes, like, for example, for middle school, those recommendations, because I feel like, is it gonna fall in the cracks? Like, it's not our scope, but it's not their scope either, but those might be important parts of this puzzle to make the program better.
Yeah, we did. So we did get some questions about that, and what we've stated to people, and there's some FAQs online on the Emergent Visioning website, is that really the interest would need to come from the community for a third site. That's not something that in any of our committees or central office is going to impose on another third site. So that's something that is not within the scope of either process. And in terms, the visioning committee is looking at the pathways, the K-12 pathways. And one of the topics that was discussed was about potentially another middle school pathway. So those are some ideas being discussed. So they are looking at the K-12 pathways in the visioning process, and they can absolutely make a recommendation about, not specific sites, but about the idea of how to strengthen the pathways. So.
Okay, so they could potentially say we need to either have a K-8, for example,
Yes.
program, or have a second site for middle school. What about changing one of the elementary school? I mean, no Key, obviously, it just changed, but like Claremont, because that will affect obviously the feeders. And my question there is, like, there's obvious things that have to happen right now. For example, the Northwest, and we'll talk about it probably, schools needs probably to move from the feeder. But if the recommendation comes from the visioning committee that Claremont might be moved, then we will have to do this again.
They're not going to recommend school moves. That's not within their scope either. Yeah, no, that's, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ideas being discussed in the community, but they're not going to recommend school moves. And so we're really focused on, if any of these things come to fruition or change, Paula, this can be reassessed at a later date. Right now, these are all ideas. Nothing's even been formalized into a recommendation. There's a whole process, that would take place after a committee makes any recommendations from there. So I think at this point, there's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of things being discussed, but for our work, I think we have some challenges and some things that we can address. And I think one of the things that we'll talk about tonight is the scope of this work. If in terms of the adjustments, we do have the flexibility to, really work towards our stated goals of balancing the proportions. Or if the collective group is feeling that we need to make limited adjustments at this time, I think those are our two options. We can go kind of full in and really set out what the stated piece about balancing the proportion of English and Spanish speakers and also free and reduced lunch. But if there's concerns, with some of these other ideas and what the impact might be, this committee can take a more limited approach and make some more limited changes. But I think I don't want that to limit this, because none of us know what will or will not happen in the future in terms of these ideas that are being discussed. Right now there's no plans. That's the one thing I can say with 100% certainty. There are no plans for a second site at middle school, and no plans for a third elementary immersion site. You know, there's no plans to move either of Key or Claremont. I can say that definitively right now. There's no plans. You know, what happens in the future, I can't predict, but right now, you know, that's, so I think, you know, armed with that kind of knowledge, I think, like for us, focusing in on the current challenges of the feeder and how can we strengthen it now, you know, along those lines. But we are open, you know, to, if we need to be more limited, if this committee wants to take a more limited approach to some changes, that's certainly within the scope. So, you know, we set out to balance, but if this committee wants to take a more limited approach, you know, and we explain our rationale and reason when we go to the superintendent with why, you know, we're not balancing, you know, and this is the limited changes we want to make at this time, that's something that we can explore. We just want to have a strong rationale for doing so. I think I saw one other hand. I don't know if I answered that person's question, but after Paul, I think there was another hand. Okay. All right. So let's start with feedback from the community.
Hey, Jonathan, I'd really
Yes.
love to dial in if you're still working on that. I'd appreciate it. I'm having some trouble over here, so.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you. I was trying to look for the phone number because it's usually right in the calendar link, but it was not. So I'm continuing to look for that. Let's see here. So while I'm doing that, Claremont, you got quite a bit of feedback in your survey. With the Claremont team, would you mind kind of sharing some highlights of the feedback that the community shared with you over the past couple of weeks in regards to the feeder work?
Sure. Paula, do you want to start or you want me to start? All right, I can go ahead and start. I mean, I will say we got a lot of feedback of people who are confused why this was happening. And then feedback from people confused why boundaries keep changing, which to me was a little interesting because the immersion boundaries have never changed, but I know neighborhood boundaries change a lot. So I think a lot of people feel blindsided by this process. I don't think personally, this is me speaking, not the feedback. There hasn't been a lot of updates about the visioning committee and what they're doing. So we were really the first opportunity for people to provide feedback. And so we got a lot of extra feedback that doesn't apply to the feeder structure at all. And I feel like there were probably a lot of emotions because people didn't feel like they've had any impact. That said, you know, we have those Cardinal, Nottingham, and Tuckahoe feeders in the northwest corner. And for the most part, support from those families was pretty strong to move them to Key, since their kids are on the bus going past Key every day to get to Claremont. There was some concerns with a few families who have older students, one from Cardinal and then some from the other feeders that were on the table to be moved about grandfathering, or rather keeping students at the same school. So I know that's people were very concerned about their children having to change schools. People brought up the pandemic a lot as a reason not to do this now. But I feel like there's, you know, always going to be a reason in that regard. But people kept saying, you know, consistency is important because of the pandemic. So if that's something we want to consider. But I mean, the other concerns really were around the commitment from APS to immersion. People brought up that Gunston's far away. So how can we continue from Claremont? There was also people confused that if they got moved to Key, would they still be able to go to Gunston? Would they be eligible, or is that only the South Immersion Middle School? There's obviously a lot of support for proximity to the school. People want to be where the shorter bus rides are for their children, keeping their kids off the bus. There was a lot of support for the current east-west boundary. Some concern about a north and south divide that kind of naturally is coming because of where Key is now moved to, and where Claremont currently is. So if that Claremont move is off the table, how do we address that divide? There was some request to explore moving Claremont somewhere that could be a little more central within its structure, since it's kind of at the southern end of the county. Let's see. There was some general concerns about transportation and hub stops as well. They were concerned about transportation driving this process because they think the hub stops need to be revisited before we can say, you know, this is what transportation needs. And then some concerns for families who have younger students not yet in the program. So if we say current students can stay at their school, what does that mean if you have a rising kindergartner next year? Would that one have to go to a different school? So we can talk about that a little bit later. More concern from APS about their commitment to immersion in general. There came up a lot of times that, you know, why was Key in a building that cannot accommodate its size? Even though immersion is popular, it seems like we're trying to reduce the amount of opportunities for kids to be in immersion, making the immersion programs overcrowded. Can we find a solution to overcrowding with this process? And then, you know, we're kind of doing this process in a vacuum. Again, to the point I made earlier, you know, the only thing people were able to give feedback on was this feeder structure so far as the visiting process goes to speak. So people are saying, you know, this seems to be done in a vacuum. How do we look at the whole picture of immersion and not just this small piece of the feeder structure? And then people are requesting that APS considers expanding the building capacity at Key, looking at the size of the smaller building there, taking away seats in immersion. And then I think the biggest thing is some families within the Carlin Springs and Barcroft boundaries were saying they wanted to stay at Claremont. Some of them said it's closer to them because of where they live within the boundaries. And a parent brought up that, you know, other groups like soccer and community activities zone Carlin Springs as South Arlington. So if they moved, maybe they wouldn't be part of those communities. People also talked about a reverse commute against traffic from Carlin Springs. And then really just some concerns about how is diversity going to be considered to balance the people, make sure we consider the families who are impacted the most, not just those who have access to complete the survey easily in the short deadline. And then another point that was brought up was a misconception about the socioeconomic status of our Spanish-speaking families. It seems like a lot of times people think that that's only the English learner families or only free and reduced lunch families. So making sure we consider the Arlington community as a whole. And then there was a lot of general comments about immersion, so I won't get into that too much, but you know, really, how can we make sure this is sustainable? I think this is going to be kind of the first way for trust to be built within families, that there is still a commitment to immersion. And so what I think that's just something we need to consider in our messaging is that this can't come out alone of here's the new feeder structure without any other, I guess, the context of the rest of the visioning process. And then we have about 25 questions about the visioning process that obviously won't come into play here. But people really, there was some concern about like why this is happening now, especially with the pandemic, since APS pushed off the neighborhood boundaries at this point. So that's kind of the high level summary from what we heard in the surveys.
Great, thank you. That was excellent. Key, anyone from Key want to share some of the feedback they have heard from their community over the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, so some of the issues that were covered already by Claremont, there is a little bit of confusion, and that was the main reason. Actually, most of the discussion came. We had actually a live discussion about it, and the confusion is, why are we doing this when the boundaries are going to change next year? And so, you know, the data is unclear now, and why are we doing this now? So the timing, which is one of the last points that Rachel just raised. For Key, the concern was also the amount. I shared the documents that you sent, and it was a lot of information, but it takes a lot of time to go through that. And so it was, you know, a little bit puzzling in terms of what exactly is requested. You know, we're requesting the community to comment on. issues that concern Key the most, obviously we have different issues because we moved the building. And so we are facing a lot of new issues and we have no responses to this. So the main issue for us is the public transportation to the school. We still have that not solved for some of the low income people who might not have a car, particularly to go and pick up the kids after extended day when there is no transportation back for the kids. So that's a major concern. The main issue that was raised both by the English-speaking people and the Spanish-speaking is not losing the communities that have been part of Key for a long time and they feel part of the family. So they might be far away, relatively far away from the school, but if we had the good public transportation, that would be, a way to make sure that they remain connected to the school. They want to stay with the school. There were concerns also about, making the program smaller. We were promised many times in the past and moving would not have reduced the size. And we have lost 2 classes in kindergarten. So that was one of the concerns. We're generally speaking happy to welcome the schools that are right now. I mean, the communities that are north of Key right now, those kids that, bus right in front of Key and go to Claremont at the moment. The uncertainty there is, we don't know how many. There's such a strong connection. Jillian raised this earlier. This is, for us at least, there was such a strong connection between the location of the school and the communities that went there, at least for some of the people, that we don't know how that is going to change with the new location. We assume that there will be more people in the area around the new location at Key and north of Key that will like to go there and create that sense of community again, but we don't know. But there's no objection to having those school feed into Key. The main concern really is about losing some of the communities we have, and also to make sure that we keep a really strong balance between the 50 and 50. Basically, we really value that diversity there. And some of the other issues are, as you said, related to the visioning, and similar to what Rachel said.
Great. Thank you for that summary.
Oh, and then one final thing is the confusion between same issue, the visioning and the feeder discussion, which is they're separate, and I understand the logic, but then it means that one half doesn't know what the other half is discussing.
Thank you for that. Gunston?
Actually, we did not get a lot of feedback. I actually could not find the English. I don't know if Adon was able to look at the English. I didn't see any on the Spanish document.
Right. The English just has a couple of responses, so it's not really a lot of data either.
I think they were just very generic questions for it, unless they answered if they have children in the elementary school level for our middle schoolers, right? It's not a big impact, and the questions were very generic. I don't feel like parents, unless they're really following it because they have elementary school age children, they're probably like, what? I have no idea what this really means, right? So.
Okay.
And a couple of responses from the English side really surprisingly mirror very closely the feedback so far from Key as well as Claremont.
Thank you for that. Wakefield, Mary, and Bill.
Hi, yes. It sounds like a lot of other people got a lot of feedback. I know I commented this to you, Jonathan, but I think my email got lost. On the high school level, there were a flurry of emails around homecoming that the other grades didn't worry about. There were no responses for the Spanish, and honestly, I only received 4 on the English as well as an individual outreach. So not a lot, and a little bit because of this, though there were so few responses, it's a little bit difficult to kind of aggregate together. I'm looking here at the points. I think in general, people were concerned about the positives were proximity if they were close to things. The overwhelming thing was don't shrink the immersion programs. People were upset about the now shift of Key School, for example, to ATS. They want to make sure that that is not shrunk. If anything, if there's an opportunity to grow it. Some concern about balancing the north and south in terms of schools. Like the person said, don't let all the north schools just go to Key and all the south low income kids just go to Claremont. There should, if the schools are full, the acceptance rates in the lottery amounts should be the same. Please take the lottery into consideration. So that was one comment about equaling out that, which is a bit contradictory with some of the other comments where people appreciated having a central location or realized that lack of a central location for, say, the middle school and high school was a factor in the feeder with a drop in the immersion program, which is what I've heard. And other than that, echoing the same comments about people not being clear about how this related to the boundary change emails that were sent out. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, so a lot of threads around proximity, and I think we see that in the data as well in terms of like the applicants to the schools. I'm hearing, it seems like for both the Key and Claremont community, the Cardinal, Nottingham, Tuckahoe preference for being reassigned to Key, while at the same time some concerns about what a north-south divide might do, to the program in terms of the demographics of both schools. Transportation concerns with hub stops. And Kristen, could I actually have you just kind of speak to that, just to give people the sense, I think, if there were any, changes to the feeder structure, how that would impact hub stops. If you could just speak to that for a few minutes, would you mind?
Sure. I don't anticipate there being a lot of change. It's more that, once the feeder structure is changed, then the stops that may have served Claremont before and now serve Key, they would tend to be switched. So I think that's essentially what we're looking at. It's hard to say specifically what would happen, obviously, until we know a bit more about what the feeder structure is going to look like.
Is it a possibility, Kristen, that certain hub stops could change based on where the location of the students are for the site and like the transportation network, depending on the feeder change, or are the current hub stops kind of set?
No, the philosophy, if you will, behind the hub stops is to establish them in locations where where students from any point around the stop who go to the given school would know where it is and know how and be able to access it, right? So we're trying to kind of make them, completely established. We tend to see, if we based it on where students live, I guess is, probably the better way to frame it. If, for example, we don't have students attending 1 year in a particular area, and this is true for any of the hub stops, do we just eliminate the stop altogether and then we'd have to keep bringing it back? We're trying to create some level of certainty of where the stops are, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does. No, thank you. Great. Any questions before we proceed to the next part of our agenda?
One comment I'd like to make is, while it does appear that proximity is a big concern, there are certain outliers. For example, the Barrett zone is walkable to Key, the current location to Key, but the lottery numbers as well as the kind of application ratios for this current school year didn't really show an uptick, despite the fact that the school is now walkable. And the because the Spanish speaking population is, quite decent in the Barrett zone.
Yes. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that.
I think actually when you look at the correlations, you see that they didn't change. I'm sorry, if you look at the correlation with location, you see that the correlation between location, distance from the school, and applications pre-move, that Key had a higher correlation than Claremont did. But then once Key moved, the correlation plummeted, in part because the trends of which feeder schools had higher applications remain the same year over year. In other words, it didn't change. People from Barrett didn't start applying to Key, even though Key is close to Barrett. And people from the innovation zone kept applying to Key, even though Key is now farther from the innovation zone. And I think what I take from that is that the relationship to the community matters a lot. And that look purely at the pool of applicants is actually not the way that we need to support the 50-50 structure. And going back to our charge and going back to the information that was sent out in May about what we're supposed to do, I thought that what we were aiming for was to support the 50-50 structure. And so I think we should be clear on that before we leap to assuming that we need to have a balanced pool to do that.
Yes, no, it definitely is.
Yeah, one other nuance that I sense is that the fact that neither school is now on major public transportation access, that actually hurt enrollment noticeably. Whereas prior, Key School was a very accessible location with multimodal transport.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, this is actually a great segue into the activity I'd like for us to do. I want to give people some time to think through with their groups and take some on activity 2. I'm going to share the Google Doc in the chat. We didn't really get, I think, sufficient time last time to really think through some of the challenges of the current feeder structure. And so I just put in the chat the link to that document. And if you scroll down a few pages down to activity 2, challenges, I'd like everyone to take 5 minutes and in your respective box here, just if you could add some notes here, and this will help frame our whole group discussion on the challenges. So I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes. I'm going to mute. If you want to ask any questions in the chat, you can, but go ahead and in the respective box, add in some of what you see are the challenges with the current feeder structure. I'm going to pause and let you work, and then we'll come back. Okay, about 2 more minutes. Give everyone 2 more minutes. Okay. I'd like to give someone who hasn't maybe yet shared tonight a chance to share. With someone who hasn't spoke tonight, would you like to share maybe one of the challenges that you see with the current feeder structure of the group? Emily, Heather, or Tanya, would you mind sharing one of the challenges that you see? No, they might not realize they're on mute.
Hi, this is Heather. Sorry, because I'm here for FAC, I really don't have access to some of the things the Key community has said in the last few weeks. So I'm not sure. I would just underscore everything that everybody has said. You know, it's really hard to think about. I understand all of what you're saying about the purview of this subcommittee, but it's also really hard to prize it out from the overall goal of the visioning committee in general. You know, I think we want the 50-50 balance. We want a balanced applicant pool. We want everybody to have the same opportunity to get into immersion that wants to get into immersion, but we also want a strong program. We want enough kids in the program to maybe overcome some of the obstacles that keep people from going from elementary to middle and then middle to high school. It's just it's also interconnected. You know, it's not just location, it's not just transportation, it's also communities. As far as I know you're going to ask about this later, the legacy attendance. I think it's really hard. I think we should do what we can to keep families together. So if there's a family at a school now that this could potentially affect, I think they should be given the option. I was in a planning group when Discovery opened. My son actually started at Claremont, and we were given that choice to either keep him at Claremont and my daughter go to Key, or to move him to Key and keep them together. I think we should give families the choice. I think we shouldn't be throwing up any stumbling blocks that would make people potentially pull their kids from immersion because it would be really ridiculous to have them in 2 separate immersion schools. So either let older kids stay where they are, or let younger kids follow, you know, or let little kids stay with the big kids. I don't want to throw up any obstacles where the older kid could stay, but the new kid has to move, those kinds of things. It's a lot of moving pieces. So just trying to wrap my head around that. And I know you mentioned in one of your, one of the documents, somebody asked about capacity, and actual attendance, actual enrollment is much higher than capacity in both places. And I think the capacity of Key does not reflect, that's building capacity, doesn't reflect the portables, the trailers. And I know at least at Key, I think you'd have some really strong resistance to trying to shrink the program. So.
Thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. Melania, would you mind sharing some of the challenges that you see with the current feeder structure?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest one right now is that we have families at Claremont that literally drive past Key to get to Claremont. And so they could be driving or in the bus for 8 minutes and they're on the bus for 40 minutes or, 15 minutes and it's 40 minutes. I think that's the most obvious one. Honestly, I think looking at the numbers, at least from my perspective, it doesn't matter, right? Like I think it was mentioned before, like there's no correlation between the school zones that have the most Spanish speakers are not applying to our immersion programs. And I think and that's why this process goes hand in hand with the visioning, because unless there is outreach, those numbers are never going to change, right? Unless they know about the program, they know about the impact immersion has on English learners, it's going to be a proximity issue, right? They're going to go to where they're most comfortable. As I see the numbers right now, there are not enough Spanish speakers applying to the program for a third immersion. Like I can see why APS wants that to be driven by the community, because you can't sustain a 50-50 program when you see who's applying right now. Or in the last 3 years, which were the numbers that we had. So, I think that's the challenge, right? Because we could balance all the numbers perfectly between the schools, but in the end, it's the same. The numbers are very consistent on who keeps applying to the programs traditionally, unless our visioning task force has an amazing plan to do outreach and change those numbers, right? That I think that's the challenge, where we really don't know. We could balance all we want, but we really don't know who's going to apply, because it seems like it's from the same neighborhoods, the same people that have always done it.
Thank you, Melania. Paula?
I want to add to what Melania said in that part of the Spanish-speaking population. And I really feel like there's either a misconception or the way that data is being collected, it just doesn't let us see this balance that there, I think is probably is. If we see the lottery numbers, you have only, I think it was 2 in Claremont and 3 in Key, or vice versa, of the Spanish-speaking applicants that didn't take the offer. But then when you enroll, then they're not enrolled with like Spanish speakers because of the EL and the way that enrollment happens. So I really feel like we need to clean that data to understand who is really Spanish speaker, to really see what is the balance that we have. Versus like you apply as a Spanish speaker in the lottery, but then you enroll as an English speaker because you don't want to be identified as an EL. And we had this conversation the last meeting. I think that we might have some it's not going to be 50-50 at this point, but it's not as far as we think that it is.
No, thank you for that, Paula. And yeah, there were some instances of that where students, and we shared that with filling out Spanish. I will say though, the total number, it was, I think about, it was less than 20. It was still significant, but in this of the 400 some odd applications, about 20 had, applied to the Spanish side lottery, said they were Spanish speaker, were then registered as English. So I think there's definitely some discrepancy. I don't know if it would really skew the percentages that much in terms of the scale. But it is definitely something that I think it needs to be, considered and thought about in terms of what else, how might we do things differently to try to have more consistency in that regard. But yeah, thank you. Rachel?
No, I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned that is that there's confusion over what the boundary is. I remember being told it's an east-west split based on Glebe Road. So you live on that side of Glebe Road, so you go to Claremont, and I live on this side of Glebe Road, so I go to Key, which actually, if you look, that wasn't 100% true. It seems like that was kind of one of the roads that was picked. And then, I think part of the feedback we were also getting about there's always a boundary change is because those neighborhood boundary changes do affect immersion, even if it seems like they don't. Like our map's not changing, but our map does change. You have to update it every time, when Fleet opened, when Reed opened, when Abingdon and Drew does, you won't have to move at that time. But for the most of the times, anytime those boundaries change. So I think there's a lot of confusion. Like the fact that multiple families put in, why do we change the boundaries every 2 years? I was kind of shocked by that feedback, but clearly there's confusion over what the boundaries are. So I think that's something to consider, since I know in the beginning we had talked in the first meeting, somebody had brought up potentially a geographic boundary and less reliance on a feeder school. And then I think kind of to the point, I know you said like, we're not the team who says move the program, but if we're saying everything is showing us that proximity to the building is what brings people to the program, both English speakers and Spanish speakers, I don't know how we can ignore the fact that Claremont is not where the census says Hispanic families live. It's not where the data shows that the Carlin Springs Spanish speakers are. Like they're not coming to Claremont. Nothing's going to change. I mean, how much would it change if we say go to Key instead? Are they magically going to say, sure, it's the same bus ride, but it goes north instead of south. So now we're coming to the program. Like it just, I feel like there is something to be said that like a challenge with the structure is how far you have to go and how easy it is for people to access the program, both, during school hours because of the school bus or for extended day. Like Claremont is one of the biggest extended day programs. We have 240 some kids. We max out at 250. So getting to the school is a big deal. It sounds like Kia talked about some challenges with extended day pickup for their families as well. Like, I think that's something that's kind of forgotten, is that it's not just the bus ride to and from school. Like, we don't get a late bus. If we did, then we could put the schools wherever we wanted almost, not quite, but sorry, I'm being facetious now. But so I think there is something to still be said about the locations of the program being a challenge with the feeder structure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Maybe one more person, if anyone wants to share, and then I'll kind of share the next. Okay. Thanks. So let me, so I did, because this has come up too, at our last meeting, people brought up the idea of, moving, would it be possible to move away and from assigning neighborhood schools and looking at it geographically. I did discuss that with a team of APS staff, transportation, from equity, and we did consider that. There's some significant concerns for multiple staff around transitioning to that type of model. As even now, as people have pointed out, people with having set neighborhood schools assigned to which school, people our office, not our office, but school community relations gets a lot of questions about that, about even knowing which school they should apply to. And so there was some concern that with geography, if you don't have it based on neighborhood school, there's going to be even more confusion if it's like Columbia Pike, Glebe Road, George Mason Drive, whatever the geographic areas would be, that there would be even more confusion. And so I think there was a lot of concern with that. So I think that was considered, but just based on the feedback from staff, that isn't something that direction we're going to be able to move for this with our committee. But we can look at some adjustments to it where the neighborhood schools are assigned. Jillian?
So I think you heard that when I appreciate that you talked to staff,
Mhm.
And staff is guessing that they would hear more questions if it were not based on school. We talked to families and we heard that families are more confused by the school-based assignments than a geographic assignment, especially if it were a simple geographic assignment. So I feel like staff is asserting some things without talking to people, asserting things about people's impressions without talking to the people that would have those impressions. And here we are doing the work of actually going out and talking to our communities, and our communities are saying the opposite of what staff is assuming.
Well, I don't know if we have I think that you bring up an important point. I'm not sure if there's when we say the community, if there's a consensus amongst the community or a high degree of feedback that like they want a geographic model versus the neighborhood schools. But I do think, with the staff that were involved, they were across departments, across schools, and folks who've been in the program and who have fielded questions from families and worked closely with families in the community for over a decade, who are part of this group. And so I want to honor kind of the concerns and of what is seen as kind of, feasible and in the best interest of the program and families. And I not to negate the feedback that some people have heard about wanting to move in this direction, but it is not going to be within our scope for this committee to kind of transition to a geographic kind of model.
It's really tough here when you're saying staff is assuming something without having gone to I fully agree with you that we have done limited outreach, but we on our volunteer time have done outreach. You're saying staff is assuming something without ever having done the outreach. We've never been geographically based, so it's not like they're like, oh, 8 years ago when it was geographically based, we did have this experience. No, they are assuming, having not done any of the legwork, we did some legwork for free for you, and you're saying, don't worry about it. That's off the table. We're not going to listen to you. That's really frustrating as someone from the community is volunteering my time here.
Appreciate that. And it's not to negate people and the efforts, and the efforts are appreciated for the outreach and feedback. But when we also look at operational feasibility and the whole host of other considerations, communications, that those were all considered. And in that, I'm going to go to Rachel and then Kristen.
Okay, I just have a quick question. So we can't use geography, which is well, I'll take that off the table. But that means next year, Barcroft is probably losing students potentially to Drew. If we move Barcroft to Key, now we have just moved students from Claremont to Key back to Claremont when they get redistricted to Drew. That was part of the getting started proposal initially that they're using for the Abington Drew transfer. There are weird nubs that cross major roads that feed into Fleet, to Hoffman, Boston, and Barcroft. So I just feel like then we're doing this out of order. If we're tied to neighborhood schools, then we need to wait potentially. The island in Northwest is kind of its own scenario. So we could do that now. But if we're saying we're tied to neighborhood schools and we don't know where they're going, like we could be dividing families or double moving families or having to figure out grandfathering for students who are going to enroll in 2022 to 2023. So they're grandfathered in 2023 to 2024 and maybe all their siblings too. So I feel like what's the point of us being here? I guess it's a little disheartening because it doesn't seem like parent feedback or committee feedback matters at that point if we're doing this. And yeah, sorry.
I think one thing I did hear, in the summaries that everyone shared, was really the folks that are north. The one thing that's been readily apparent is the folks who live north of Key and Cardinal, in the Cardinal attendance zone, which actually the ATS walk zone is also in the Cardinal attendance zone as well. So there are people who can are eligible to walk to the current Key immersion site who live in Cardinal, but it's currently assigned to Claremont. So the Nottingham, Tuckahoe, Cardinal, the feedback that you guys have obtained has really seemed to indicate kind of a strong preference for being to Key. The Key community has, has shared with their representative that they would welcome that community. And so I think that to me, that piece has come through strongly in the feedback that has been gathered. And I think, that's an important thing for this committee, to take into account. I think it seems like the real kind of challenge as we laid out this feedback, and I'm going to pull up the map here in a second, and then Kristen, I'll be right with you, is really thinking about this region here in the middle of Carlin Springs, Barcroft, Barrett, Fleet, and Long Branch, and Huffman, Boston. The areas that could go in either direction and still be operationally feasible for APS. So I think that that's the one piece where I think the work of this group, and I would love to get, we will in a survey get this committee's feedback on their feelings about these three schools and where they are assigned. But this is the area where I think, when we think about boundaries, you think about the zones, that's where I shared at the beginning. One option for this committee is to, make limited adjustments now based on some of the concerns and based on some of the things that are upcoming, and do the things that make the most sense now. That is definitely a direction we can go. We may not, with a limited approach through this committee and this process now, we may not move, the needle, so to speak, and some of the categories and free and reduced in other areas. But that is a decision, that this committee, can make if we want to hold off on larger whole scale changes during this process in lieu of, some of the concerns and some of the kind of a lot of the ideas that are being discussed that, time will see if what comes to fruition and what doesn't in regards to, the work of the visioning and the work of, the boundary process and other processes that are, ongoing and will be happening in the future. So I kind of wanted to share that with some context, because I do think, we are listening. We are, the feedback that was shared for these three schools at least seemed pretty clear, to come through. And these schools here, I think this is the real kind of would be the real muscle for us to work through is what makes the most sense here. Kristen?
Can I ask a question also?
Yes.
The Claremont Island, so to speak, schools, the numbers actually show that they do not actually contribute much at all to immersion. Just glancing at the, I think it's the enrollment numbers, the three schools combined are almost equivalent to one zone, Oak Ridge alone. So shifting them to not be an island and be assigned a Key, will that actually increase enrollment, or is it just that the numbers aren't there? There's no demand.
Well, I can jump in there. I live in that area, and it's distance. There's a lot of deterrence of parents to have kids so far away. Even parents that have invested a lot of money in full immersion preschools that just decide that they cannot send the kids all the way to Claremont. So they send it to Tuckahoe or to Nottingham. So I think there will be possibly an increase of demand for the program if those schools are moved to Key. But I wanted to say, just go back to what you were saying, Jonathan. Is it possible for, like, when we do this recommendation to have, the list of caveats or something, or observations, I don't know, to have this transition to geographic boundary as a recommendation, or as a, like, we think that might be something to be considered in the future, because this probably is going to be happening again. And definitely if we move to look at the Barrett, Fleet, all that area, we certainly need to identify those planning units that might be moved in the general rezoning next year.
No, thank you. Yeah, and I think that, you know, that could be, you know, with if we take the more approach of a limited adjustment now, just to those areas that make sense, you know, in terms of thinking like, regardless of a boundary process, regardless if, you know, some of the ideas of a second middle school site, are there some changes that make sense now that regardless of how those other things play out, it just makes, and I'll speak for myself, the fact that the ATS walk zone is in the cardinal attendance zone, and it's to me, regardless of what happens, that just seems to make a lot of sense that a school that has the walk zone for an immersion school would be assigned to it. You know, that, so I wonder, you know, for this committee, if we choose to take the limited approach, if that's the consensus of the majority, you know, what changes could make sense that would have, you know, limited impact on some of these other ideas that people are, you know, thinking of that could impact in the future. So just wanted to kind of put that out. Susie?
Yes, Jonathan, can I ask a clarifying question following up what Rachel said? So if we make a decision based on the current boundaries, and some of this kids will be, you know, go to a different school from the one where they're going now, what happens if next year the boundaries of the feeding school changes? I think Rachel raised that for a second, but I just want to know if they need to then move back to the school. Let's say somebody's like, you know, assigned to Key based on our decisions, but then the boundaries of their feeding school would change.
Yeah, so how that works, so for Ashland, for example, we changed that this school year from being a Claremont feeder to a Key feeder, and we offered all of the families a chance to continue at Key for 1 year. Only one family chose to continue at Claremont. They all chose to make the move to Key, but we did offer them the opportunity to remain at Claremont for another school year. So those, you know, fourth graders could finish out at Claremont. So that was in last year what we were able to do. In many of our processes, we've offered grandfathering for 1 year, but that's definitely a topic for this committee. You know, we definitely want a recommendation from this, in the next meeting, we'll focus more heavily on the grandfathering. I'm going to preview some things in a minute here, but on how we would handle grandfathering. So if, let's just say, for example, if this committee felt that Barrett Barcroft should be assigned to Key, how should we handle, you know, the students who are currently at Barcroft attending Claremont, you know, in terms of the grandfathering? You know, should it be until completion? Should it be for 1 year? And so I will kind of walk us through that, but that is definitely within the purview of this committee to make a recommendation on grandfathering for, really, we have two groups. You have students throughout the county who are attending outside of feeder now. So you do have, you know, some families in Barcroft who are currently at Key. They're currently attending outside of feeder. And similarly, you have students from Barrett who are at Claremont. And so how we handle the current kids who are outside of feeder, and then how we handle the students who become outside of feeder because of a feeder change. So next meeting, we'll dig into that. I'm going to share a document with the group to help kind of brainstorm and think and come prepared to discuss it when we meet next. But that is definitely within, yes.
Before you move off the map, so kind of what I'm talking about, if you go to Barcroft and then you cross Columbia Pike, there's this little zone to the left, right there, that in the past has been planning units that may be reassigned. It was Drew in the past during the big change for Fleet. And so who makes the decision over what happens to those families? Like, will we be able to leave it up to Senor Perdomo and Dr. Panfield to say they can stay? Will we make a decision about the future students that, you know, we haven't even met their families yet? Because those are the ones I'm talking about, just to give a little more context of what happens if that planning unit moves next year. And then
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it's not the principals unilaterally, it'd be a cross-departmental team. So this committee will make a recommendation on the feeder structure and on grandfathering, and a cross-departmental team of APS staff. So we'll have equity, we'll have facilities, transportation, planning and evaluation, and the principals kind of working through that in terms of like, here's the recommendation of the committee, and making the decision. So it won't, the final decision won't rest in the hands of any one person or principals. They will be a member of the team who kind of considers this committee's recommendation on that. I did see another hand, James.
Right, like I'm thinking about like those students who attend Barrett and say Colorado Springs, where there are large Latino populations. We would almost have to look at it as if we were doing proper outreach, proper communication, street team, educating parents to say, this is why this program would be important. We would have to use that scenario to say which school, if we had a full number of Hispanic students applying for the program, where they would properly go. We would have to almost assume if we were doing a better job with that outreach, what would be the best school based on all the things we're talking about, where they would go. And I think a lot of things come into play when we're talking about, I think it was Melanie talking about the issues of parents not knowing or knowing what school's best for them and how we're communicating. I've been at WNL and we pull a lot of kids, or a lot of our diverse immersion kids come to our IB programs. I work with those kids. A lot of those high achieving kids out of Colorado Springs or out of Barrett, I've worked very closely with those kids who are in our AP or whatever IB programs and all the other students. I am now, for instance, competing. I've never had to go down to my 8th grade with the 8th graders to make sure that I'm not competing with Arlington Science and Tech. So if they're sending people from Arlington Science and Tech to say, hey, come to our school. This year, I'm missing some of those 9th graders that would traditionally come to my school as a feeder. So there's many other factors that come to how parents are choosing. I have a Hispanic female that is top student who went to Arlington Traditional. I work with her every day on her college choices. I said, how did you get to Arlington Traditional? Well, my mother knew a woman from this community who said your daughter should go to this particular school. But for bringing it back to what we're doing, we would have to assume if we're doing justice by these families and communicating to them properly, where were the kids at Barrett if we fill those spots up go? And that's because I'm kind of feeling like the kids at Colorado Springs or Barrett, no one's here to advocate for them right now if there were parents were signing up for those spots.
So I think James, that's an excellent point, and thank you for bringing that up. But we do have the 3 years of application data to see what the current, level of interest is. But I think to your point, it's the people who aren't applying and, learning more about, why they're not applying. Is it location?
They don't know. They don't know the process. I'm at Washington Lee. I see that kindergarten information night. I see the high school information night. No one there looks like me. No one there because of the time, because of the location, because of getting to those programs. They do not know.
Yeah.
It's all done online. They do not know. We do a whole, if you look at HB Woodlawn, look at my IB program, our IB program, parents do not know how to get into these choice schools.
Yeah.
They just don't know. And when you advocate why they don't know, then it's like, well, that's not true. We do this, we do that, but we're really not talking to people. We're not going to Gates of Boston. We're not going to the AHC communities and discussing all these different programs.
And that's
can I just piggyback on that? Because I think James hit the nail on the head. I think he had it out of the park. And I think there's a lot of concern because what you seem to be asking, what we started with, where you said, what's in the charge as support 50-50 immersion model, you're interpreting to be balance the pools because there's this other process that's going to go out and improve outreach. And you're asking us to trust that this improved outreach will work. And those of us who have been in the system for a while, I mean, this is my 6th year at Key, it's hard to say that to get my head around trusting something that I've been advocating for 6 years and I've seen it fail for 6 years. I've helped people go through the Welcome Center who don't speak a word of English, walk into the Welcome Center asking to go to Key, and are directed 3 different times to go to Taylor over Key, even when they don't speak a word of English, they only speak Spanish. And it's only because someone else is there advocating for them that they actually end up at Key. It's that experience that makes it hard for me to say, oh yeah, let's just balance out the numbers. We can trust that the outreach program from a visioning process that we haven't seen results of, we haven't seen outreach from, that's going to make up for it. I think and this is really important when you have Long Branch on your map, because Key has an established relationship with some of the communities, some of the Spanish speaking communities that live in the Long Branch area and live very close to our new building. And it's really concerning to me to think that APS staff is saying, oh, it's operationally feasible to move Long Branch away from Key, because those communities that live near Glebe Road that currently are close to the Key building, some of them even walking to the Key building, speak Spanish, that we have the relationship with the community, that we would just give all that up and assign them to Claremont.
No,
that is just like, whoa, when you say operationally feasible, if you're not willing to take Long Branch off the table as not operationally feasible, in recognition of the longstanding of the relationships that we've built, and it's all just about transportation, that's concerning to me.
And this is the exact reason for having this committee and having representation across the county to share those types of perspectives and insight. And I think that's important for the group to hear, for people who may be unfamiliar with the longstanding relationship between Key and Long Branch, to help inform that choice. That the committee is going to make the recommendation. What we're sharing is that if this committee wants, they can go in either direction, but the voice and perspective you just shared along with others on this committee is really helpful in helping people kind of gain that perspective, and it is the exact reason why we have this committee, to have those voices from across the county participate. So thank you for sharing that, and it's really I think helpful to hear similar stories from other communities to help us better understand the connections and such. Melania?
I think then that's a really important point, in the sense of, we can only work with the numbers that we have right now. And so maybe we, like you suggested, then maybe we do make this, the recommendation of this committee, a very narrow, a very small change, to change just the obvious, and make sure that we keep those relationships, like Long Branch to Key, or even that those are so important. Then maybe until the visioning process takes hold and we can see that there is an interest and applications and education and outreach to those big Hispanic communities like Carlin Springs and Barrett, and how those numbers change, then we can make better informed decisions and see if we need to balance enrollment, or hopefully what I'm hoping for is that those will actually show that we have to have a third immersion elementary school somewhere over there.
Yeah, through the outreach. Yep, no, thank you. That's an excellent point. Thank you for sharing that, Melania. Kristen?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer, I'm not going to give you the transportation perspective. I'm going to give you a planning perspective. Sorry, Jonathan, because I'm a planner at heart, but I feel like, so there's a lot to unpack in both the comments that came from the community and comments from the group today, that just suggest to me that we've got a short, medium, and long-term project that we really need to kind of flesh out in that regard, because there's just between confusion between the two processes, the concern that you're this group is being asked to sort of project out in such a way that the group doesn't feel comfortable with, that I'd like to kind of see this take more of that short, medium, long-term kind of approach and kind of break it down by chunks, like, well, all right, what do we need to do in the short term? And then, flesh out further, like, what are these medium and long-term issues that are really part of this process? And again, I'm coming at this more as, my swim lane is usually transportation, but I can't help but just as I'm listening to this, feel like we're trying to do a lot more here, or we're trying to address a lot more here than we maybe can at this point. So, Jonathan, I may ask you to comment on that, because I feel like the group is churning a little bit right now, because there's a lot of expectation and a lot of weight on this. And maybe we need to kind of help break it up in such a way to make it more comfortable, I guess, in terms of how we proceed. You know what I mean?
I think, yeah, one of the things that, it's through this conversation tonight is that there's a collective feeling that people are very uncomfortable with the idea of a whole scale change because of many of the unknowns. What will the fall boundary process, what changes will happen next fall when the elementary boundaries are done? What will be some of the recommendations from the visioning process, and which of those recommendations, could be implemented in the future? There's a lot of, unknowns and what ifs that may or may not happen. So long term, I can see that recruitment, to what extent of those 125 families, Spanish speaking families from Carlin Springs, will more than 7 apply after this outreach effort? I can't answer that right now. And I don't think any of us can, or even everyone from the visioning, to predict how many more, their application rate of 6%, to how much will that increase, if at all, after all of these efforts? These are questions that we don't know. And so I recognize and appreciate that there are a lot of things right now and ideas being discussed, and that to your point, to the mid and long term, that could impact the feeder structure. Now, it's also possible that none of these ideas happen in the immediate future, in terms of like a third elementary, a second middle school, boundary process that doesn't really upset the balance of the speakers. All of these things are unknown, but I appreciate that there is, I've seemed to be my takeaway is that there is a collective concern about large whole scale changes, particularly in the central part of this map. So I want to respect the will of the group. And if, as to Melania points, if we just focus on making the changes that make the most sense now, and offer some additional, to Paula's point, maybe, that if the committee really feels strongly, and I'd want to survey the group about, having APS consider a geographic feeder structure system in the future, that's something that, we can, as a committee, after I survey and get it, that I would feel comfortable, putting in. But that's kind of my sense of the group and the pulse after our conversation, is that, the idea of whole scale changes, particularly in the middle of the map, makes it's very uncomfortable. I don't think anyone feels really confident giving feedback on that. And I'll pause, and I want to see if anyone has any final comments before we wrap up. I do want to end here by 8:30, and but
before you leave, can you talk a little bit about grandfathering, all that? Because I think for the families in the Northwest, some of them, especially those that have the kids are in the higher level, they might be interested in grandfathering.
Yes. So, and I will share this document with the group. But what we as I shared briefly, is we have kind of two groups. We have students currently attending school that is outside of their feeder, that remains outside of the feeder after adjustments. So for example, let's just say Cardinal, let's use another example here of that of the changes that we're talking about here. Tuckahoe and Nottingham is a good example.
Jamestown, we're not saying Jamestown would move, and there's one person from Jamestown who goes to Claremont.
Mhm. Yeah, so Nottingham right now to Claremont. So these 7 students, if Nottingham were assigned to Key, how should well this 5th grader will be, these 2 5th graders will be gone. So these 5 students at Nottingham, if Nottingham becomes a feeder to Key, should we offer grandfathering through completion at Claremont or for 1 year? Should we treat group 1 and 2 similarly? So again, group 2 would be the students that currently attend a school that is in their feeder that becomes outside of the feeder after adjustments. And
Isn't Nottingham group 2 and Jamestown is group 1?
yes, Jamestown, yes. So these are outside of the feeder. So these are the kids who attend the line here. So Fleet, Ashland, these are all the students who are outside of feeder. So you have 9 Fleet students. Fleet is a feeder to Key who attend Claremont. So these are all the outside of feeder students. And similar for Key, these are all the outside of feeder students. So how would we treat them as well as the kids who are in feeder who become outside of feeder? But again, if we're just talking about limited adjustments, you know, and if it's just that northwest quadrant, there doesn't seem to be any students, you know, that it would just be the Cardinal and Tuckahoe and Nottingham. Those are the 3 that we'd have to think about, you know, those 5 at Tuckahoe, the 5 at Nottingham, and the 3, 4, 6, 7 at Cardinal, of whether, you know, the committee would recommend they have the option to continue at Claremont through completion or for 1 year. In terms of transportation, we can provide transportation for 1 year for grandfathered students who remain attending outside of their feeder, and can likely commit to offering it for 1 year to any rising 5th grader, possibly for rising kindergarten to 4th, depending on the number. So these are relatively small numbers, but transportation is something that we could do for likely a year for the outside of feeder kids. But so that would be, you know, part of the recommendation, you know, that we would need to consider. I think this becomes a lot less complicated if we're just talking about, you know, a limited adjustment to the feeder structure, you know, involving, you know, 10 or 15, 20 students, current students. Now, if the committee, if we want to make some larger changes and you start bringing in schools like Harlan Springs, you know, all the ones that were circled on the map, Barrett, any of these schools for consideration, I think the grandfathering piece becomes, you know, a more challenging discussion as you think about, you know, 57 students from Harlan Springs who attend Claremont. So it does, there is kind of a relationship, and I'll pause there for questions. Rachel.
So can you just clarify what you were saying? So if if we only move Nottingham, Cardinal, and Tuckahoe because, you know, it's so far from Claremont.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the students who attend Claremont from Long Branch, Jamestown, Glebe, Discovery, Barrett, Ashland, and Fleet get to stay no matter what, and just like they are today, and we're taking them off the table from this discussion? Or are you saying we'll still need to discuss that group 2?
We would like this group to make a recommendation on group 1, the students who are currently, so these students here at Claremont, we would like for this group to make a recommendation for the people that remain outside of feeder. So yeah, for both group 1 and 2. Yeah, for both groups. Key, there's a far greater number of students who are outside of feeder. So this chart that I'm going to share this exact document with you. You can see all the outsider feeder kids below. It's not that large of a number at Claremont, but at Key, it is a fair number of students. And again, group 1 is currently not receiving transportation. So that is a big piece. The students right now who are outside of feeder, none of these students are getting transportation now because they're outside of feeder. So we're not talking about adding transportation to students who aren't getting it. It would just be a matter of whether they're allowed to continue. Kristen and then Karina. Kristen? Kristen?
All right, that's an old hand.
That's okay. Karina and then Paula.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, because I know that you and I have spoken about this before, but I don't see it in the considerations. When we look at some of the students that are out of feeder, one of the reasons is because you remember that there's a group of families that that are moving into Arlington when the application window opens for the option schools, but they are not in Arlington yet. So for the last 4 years, the families that, let's say I'm a military family and I'm in Japan right now, but I know that I will be moving to Arlington in August. So they have been directed to apply to Key for the last 4 years because Key had the smaller feeder structure. So what happens sometimes is, so I am a military family, I get put into, I apply to Key, I get a spot, and then I move into, we give them the spot regardless of when they end up moving or relocating to.
Mhm.
So if they move to, let's say, a Claremont feeder and there's space, Claremont could take them. They can move from Key to Claremont, but if there's no space, we won't take the merchant seat away. They stay at Key. So I think that some of the families ended up being out of feeder because of that circumstances. So as we move forward, we will need to think, okay, so do these families continue to apply to Key? If that is the case, we need to think about that there will always be a few outliers that might end up out of feeder depending on when they end up once they fully relocate. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, and a lot of those military families for like neighborhood schools, Karina, correct me if I'm wrong, they're zoned for like Fleet, Jefferson, and W&L.
Yeah, but those are only some of the military families that.
Myers, yeah.
I'm talking about this will be military families, State Department families, even this past year, families that were being relocated by Amazon. Is anybody that knows for sure that they are going to be living in Arlington, but don't have a permanent address yet.
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt, but I will tell you, we are one of those military families, and that was not the process for us. So perhaps that should also be refined and double checked, because we were told that we needed to apply to both schools and then we would be accepted at one depending on where we lived. And I spoke to someone, whoever is supposed to be in charge of that at headquarters. So there's some inconsistency.
What year, I'm sorry to interrupt. What year was this?
2019.
Because
right.
For the last 4 years, we have, and the reason why I can say for sure that we cleaned the portal and we do not allow any families to be in 2 lotteries is because I do it myself with another staff member.
So we were in both lotteries and we actually interviewed at both schools. And then we were told to choose a home based on which school had availability for us. So that's part of the reason I'm even here, is to say that for military families, you guys are making these decisions based on, the neighborhood schools and the this and the that. Well, first of all, when you're moving in as a military family, it is dang near impossible to figure out what neighborhood school boundaries are when you're not physically here and you don't know, and you're looking for homes and you're trying not to go above your housing allowance and. So like, if you want to talk about simplifying the process, geographic boundaries for the immersion program make a lot of sense. But also
there was a time
process of applying, because it's not as simple as what you're saying. I can tell you, I went through it and there were State Department families going through it at the same time. None of us had it as simplified as what you're stating.
Well, one of the reasons why it moved to that model was because before that model, a lot of families said that they never had a chance to apply for an option school because by the time they moved, everything, the entire application process was over. So this was a way to allow for families to participate, even if they were not in the area yet.
And so, I agree, and that's fabulous. But on paper, it may be working for you one way, but when families are actually reaching out to do the process, that's not what's happening. And that's not what they're being told, and that's not what's being routed. So when you play in that with that in these numbers, you can say that that plays into the numbers, but probably not as much as you think.
Okay.
And we can dig down to the current families. So when we get to the point, we can, Tanya, to your point, I think we can learn, to make sure that with the families that we're talking as we dig into this number is small enough here, it's manageable, where we can understand each person's situation. And I think you brought up some excellent points, and I think it's worth further discussing too. And so I'm going to take a note of that, and we can, follow up, because it is an important consideration with the grandfathering and thinking about the families we would be impacting with that. So thank you for sharing that. Susie?
Yeah, I just want to point out something that was raised in the chat about the size of the building, because those numbers right in front of us were based on the fact that we were in a bigger building that could accommodate more kids. And so now we have that imbalance, then that the key building is smaller. And so there's that consideration. And I just want to point out, we have asked and begged not to reduce it. And we were told that it would not be reduced, but it is. And there's no plan to accommodate more students at Key. And so that is partially it's frustrating, but it's also a reality that we have a smaller building. So moving kids around is not as easy as to have two buildings with the same capacity.
Correct. Yeah, it'll be really based at each grade level of how many seats each school could accommodate, through this. No, thank you. Any final last minute questions before I wrap up? Okay, Jillian.
Well, so I guess the other question was, so far, everything you've talked about has been adding areas to Key. And Key is the smaller building with the larger land. So what else is on the table here? Is there anything else that APS can do? Can you commit to allowing more relocatables and letting us go back up to 5 or 6 kindergarten classrooms? Can you? And I'm not asking you to do it now, because I obviously have to talk to people, but is there an opportunity to do work, or at least relocatables or something, to increase the capacity at Key if we're going to increase the pool assigned to Key? Or are we really, really stuck in this smaller building with the smaller limit that that was dealt last year?
Yeah, so the process for that one, Jillian, is the annual update process in the winter. So every winter, staff reviews the number of option seats to offer at each of the option schools. So the number of kindergarten classes, the number of seats for HB, all of the option schools, that's determined, and building capacity and that work is done with facilities. So that work also determines, where relocatables might need to be added. So that process is really when the number of option school seats and facility considerations would be raised over the winter time. We usually end up announcing that in January or February. February is usually when the annual update comes out that provides all of those answers around relocatables, around the number of seats that will be offered at each of the option schools, including
right. But you're not answering my question. Is there something with our process, with the immersion feeder school process, that can be done about Key's capacity? Or are we stuck with this reduced capacity? And should we make all of the decisions assuming that Key's capacity is approximately 45% of the total immersion seats?
Yeah, no, this process, we cannot determine the number of seats or relocatables. That's outside of our scope. So no, our committee and our group cannot have an impact on.
And you're not willing to go talk to anybody about that, because like I said, everything we've talked about so far, as far as an actual idea, is just adding planning units to the Key zone. And if you're going to do that without increasing the capacity of Key, then you've gotten everything out of balance. So if you're not willing to go talk about the capacity with anybody, fine. But then we're stuck with this capacity, and we have a much harder math to deal with.
It's not that I'm not willing to talk, it's that there's a separate process for that, Jillian, and that I think the Key community has been very vocal about the concerns about their building capacity. And so, that's a cross-departmental team that runs that process with facilities and instruction and other folks who are on that. So I can't really blur the two processes.
But just in the same way that you talk to a cross-departmental team about whether we could set the boundaries based on geographical locations, can you talk to them about capacity?
I'm happy to share that this committee expressed the concerns about key size, absolutely, and about the concern about, the feeder and the impact. I'm absolutely happy to share the work.
Well, it's directly related to our work here, because it's an obvious solution here is just assigning more of the pool to Key, but that would make it much harder to get into Key than it would to get into Claremont. This isn't like we're throwing out our concern that we said before. This is a very specific to this process concern.
Well, I think what I would like to do is we'll share the survey, and I'll preview it quickly, and is that everyone will provide the feedback, and when we meet next, I will share the numbers so people can see the proportions. This is the survey.
But I need to know the answer to the capacity thing to be able to answer the survey.
Well, we won't be able to provide that answer. Those decisions will be made in February around for next.
So you're not willing to talk to anybody about it in the way that you were willing to talk to people about the geography. I'm just trying to understand, just get an answer to the question. Are you going to talk to people about it or not?
But even if I talk, there's no decisions that would be made until February. So I really, it's conversations, but I wouldn't be able to share because it's not, no decisions will be made. There's a separate process for the annual update. And that process happens over the winter. So I wouldn't be able to come back to this group with any type of firm commitments or anything that would be, not appropriate and not really adhering to the processes we have for that. So I think we do have to, this committee does have to operate with the current capacity at Key and the current enrollment at Key. That is the assumption I think we have to operate when we share our input on the feeder survey.
Can I just summarize what I think you're saying, Jonathan, to make sure I'm hearing you correctly? So what you're saying is that the annual process that looks at each school building, regardless of program, and says, this is how many seats are available in this building, and potentially also this is how many relocatables the grounds can support and the cafeteria can support. That doesn't occur to the winter.
Yes.
So we won't know for sure what the true capacity of Key and Claremont are until the winter. But one assumption, I'm assuming somewhere they're projecting the number of seats. Like they were projecting Key and Claremont would be 6 classrooms this year, and then that update process changed it. So is there the projection somewhere that say they're projecting Key as 4 classrooms? Because based on what you had shared with us, I thought APS was moving to push Key down to 3 classrooms because that's all the building capacity can support. And so I was looking at some of the data thinking, we now only have 7 emergent kindergartens. We can't put more kids at Key. We need to take some of them out of Key. So what is I guess if you were to talk to facilities today and they needed to make a decision today, somewhere they're projecting, there's like 10-year projections out there. Like what number of kindergartners go in each program? So we at least have a starting point. Is it 50-50? Because I think we do need to kind of address that. I understand it may change, but then maybe that's also to the point of our committees meeting out of order if there's all these other pieces that we don't know yet.
I think the thing with option schools is we set the size by the number of kindergarten classes offered. So it's not the enrollment is not as vulnerable to fluctuations in the same way that neighborhood schools are, because we're controlling how many students, whereas a neighborhood school, any given year, you could have an influx of kindergarten, but every year the number of kindergarten classes is set for Key and Claremont. The building capacity of Key is published online. It's 465. That is the published capacity. Now with the current relocatables, they add another 200 seats with the 8 relocatables that are there. But those numbers are publicly available on our website. So that won't, the building capacity is what it is. That's the design capacity of that building. And at the annual update is when decisions are made about what schools may need relocatables, what schools do not need any additional ones to manage their enrollment, how many classes we offer at our option schools. So all of those decisions are made in the winter about how to ensure, manageable enrollment, and whether it requires any adjustments in terms of like the number of seats offered and any relocatables that might be needed.
Okay, so is it correct to assume that as of right now, it may change as part of that process, but as of right now, there's going to be 4 kindergarten classes at Key this fall and 4 kindergarten classes at Claremont?
I can't even say that. That will be determined this winter. I can't say if it, what number it will be. It's gonna we'll review their enrollment at the time in this winter, and then a decision will be made, by the team of to how many classes after enrollment is reviewed and building capacity is reviewed. Yeah. Melania?
I think it's just a matter of wait lists. I mean, we've looked at the numbers of people who have been applying, and really it becomes right. Like, I don't think capacity in the sense, like, it's not going to affect necessarily unless a huge wave of people, because of a location change, decide that now they don't want to go to their neighborhood school and they want to go to an option school. Right, like, it's a significant change. It really just makes the wait list at Key a little bit longer, and maybe at Claremont a little bit shorter, but even then it might not even affect the wait list at Claremont, because I think the numbers show most of those English speaking applicants come from Abingdon zone. So, right, like, I feel like capacity is not even on the table on this discussion. I don't understand. Sorry.
Yeah, for the limited changes. Yeah, no, thank you. A last question. Thank you, Jillian.
Thanks. Did you, so you were talking about the considerations that they think about in the annual update when they decide how many kindergarten classes. Do they look at the potential pool, and do they look at the wait lists?
No, it's that's not factored in. The number of classes offered in enrollment and the capacity of the facility, those are really the big drivers.
So so if the pools were totally different, they wouldn't function, they wouldn't factor in the, basically it's that much harder for people that live north, in the north part of the county to get into immersion than people in the south part of the county. If that's what, basically if we do what you've pointed out.
Well, it's really what the group thinks is best. It's a committee. I want to hear when the survey, the feedback. There'll be a point to kind of share what, and everyone has.
Okay, but can you answer the question about whether they take into account the wait lists and the pools? If the pool is much bigger for Key and much smaller for Claremont, would they say, oh, maybe we need to do 5 kindergartens and 3 kindergartners or something like that to balance out the chance of getting it?
Yeah, no, that would be considered if the building has capacity. If there were space and the interest,
okay.
that would certainly be taken into consideration.
Okay, and to Melania's point, the distance between Cardinal and the new Key building is under 1 mile, and then Tuckahoe and Nottingham is about 2 miles.
Yeah.
And it's a significant change from the old Key building. And so, I mean, we know of families that tried to apply to Key this past year and were told, no, you can only apply to Claremont, and therefore they didn't apply to immersion at all. So we're sure that the numbers of applicants from those areas would go up if they were applying to Key. We don't know by how much, but we know that it would be more. And you're right, you're probably right, it probably won't reduce Claremont's wait list, but it would increase Key's wait lists, which effectively just makes it harder for everybody else to get in. So the question is, how do you balance that? If they're going to take it into account during when the decision about how many kindergarten classes to offer, that's helpful to know.
Yes, so I will send out the survey. I'll give everyone, some time. I think, we've kind of landed on a more limited process, but I don't want to speak for everyone. I know. So I will share the survey as is. There's a part at the bottom to share additional comments and questions. And I'd like to come back when we meet next. I will aggregate and share the results to see like what the kind of majority feels in terms of the assignments, and then I will run the numbers and share, you know, how it would change kind of the balance of the pool, and then we can talk, you know, go from there. I think at this point, in terms of going back to the community, we're welcome to continue if we'd like. We can keep having people go into the survey, but I think, you know, after the next meeting, we'll have more of a draft recommendation to share out. I think at this point, it's premature. I want to gather this group's input, run the numbers, come back to you in a couple of weeks, and then from there, we'll leave the October 25th meeting with a kind of a draft proposal that we can get the community's reaction to. But we seem to be leaning towards a more limited process for the reasons we've discussed, you know, at length here. And I think that, you know, I want to honor the collective of the group and the majority of feelings. But
would you share the draft before our meeting?
Yeah, the data, yes. Yep. So I will give everyone until Sunday. I really need a solid week to run the data. So I'll send out the survey. You need to send it out tonight. And then if everyone could complete it by Sunday, and I'll send it to everyone on the email, that would give me next week to run the numbers and share it with everyone prior to the 25th meeting.
Can I ask a clarification? I know we talked about doing a limited process,
Yeah.
but like if we did move a feeder beyond the northwest ones, or I don't know, something else happens as part of the neighborhood redistricting, like the boundaries change significantly, like, you know, they cross and suddenly like Carlin Springs and Ashlawn, like half go to one school and half go to another. And so it kind of messes up our map. Are people locked in? Like what is, like, I know with other immersion processes, like we don't move planning units generally like so many years in a row as, you know, an objective. Is there any kind of like, if we moved Carlin Springs, well, I guess if we moved Fleet to Claremont to balance out the Northwest schools, does that mean, you know, next year or in 2 years, we can't move Fleet when we want to do a larger process? Like what is the, like, is there any, like, if we're talking about short, medium, and long term, you know, when, because obviously we don't want to move families like multiple times because that's just not fun for anybody.
Yeah.
But where is the, you know, like, is there any like guidance from APS that says we guarantee families only have to move one time in their child's elementary career, not siblings, but, or, you know, is there a policy around that? I guess is what I'm asking.
That is a policy consideration, is to try to not impact students in the same school level. So that a lot of the boundary process, well, like at the middle and high school, we've been able to, like the last middle school process, you know, we're adjusting Gunston in this process, Gunston and Jefferson, but that last time that was done, those current students, they will be in high school next year. So the same group of kids was not impacted twice. Now at the elementary level, there's been some changes in past years, but we are trying to honor that so students are not impacted more than once while at that school level. It's one of the 6 considerations in the boundary policy. It is one of the 6.
So is that VPI to grade 5 then, or kindergarten to grade 5?
Yes, it's generally seen as the students while they're enrolled at that school.
But does that mean that what happens in the immersion process would drive the neighborhood boundary process, to Rachel's question? You wouldn't move a planning unit because the immersion kids in that planning unit?
No.
So if you move the planning unit, would you just legacy accept the other kids and leave them in the immersion? So you've got immersion based on geography anyway?
Yeah, that's essentially, you know, what happened in this last process, right? Is that the Ashlawn boundary changed, and we also made it a feeder to Key, and so we offered a grandfathering provision based on that change. But it was more the neighborhood process happened, and then the option school was, you know, considered, and the decision was to offer the grandfathering. So the immersion feeder structure is not going to drive, you know, another process like that, but considerations can be made like we did this year for the Ashlawn students for grandfathering to allow them to stay in their current community.
But that would mean you'd have to legacy accept kids well past 1 year, because there could be a kid in 1st grade right now who gets moved from Key to Claremont. And then if their planning unit gets moved back to a Key feeder, you wouldn't switch them again within elementary school, right? So you'd be talking about the rest of elementary school. It wouldn't be a 1-year legacy exception.
Well, those rules are made, you know, in terms of the length of the grandfathering and all of those, that's all situational in each process to deciding how long for each student in the situation. So I do want to respect everyone's time, and if any more questions, please include them on the survey. I want to answer everyone and give the questions, you know, answer them and give everything due consideration. But I do want to honor everyone's time. We've been over. This is a great conversation. I do really respect everyone's input and think that, you know, understandably, there's a lot going on in the program right now. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of, you know, uncertainties of what will come of the recommendations, what the recommendations will be, how this will impact. So I fully honor and respect that, and you know, we'll make adjustments accordingly. And I'm going to review everyone's feedback on the survey, and we'll share the results as well, so that people can see, you know, what the group was. I'll share them, you know, in the aggregate. So thank you all.
Could you download the chat before you close the Zoom? There's been some good conversation in there too.
Yep, absolutely, will do. All right, thank you all. I will send out the survey and that grandfathering sheet, and we'll just be communicating via email between now and the next few weeks. And feel free to keep gathering that general feedback about concerns about the current feeder structure, questions your community has. We can certainly bring that back to the next discussion when we meet again in a couple of weeks. So that's definitely still something we can do to give people more time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Have a
All
good
right.
night.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.